I'm Caroline McCoy. I'm the Oxford American's digital managing editor, and I'm here with the writer Steve Yarbrough. Steve is the author of 12 books, most recently the novel Stay Gone Days. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters Award for Fiction, the California Book Award, the Richard Wright Award, and the Robert Penn Warren Award. His novel, The Unmade World, won the 2019 Massachusetts Book Award for Fiction. He's also contributed numerous works of fiction and nonfiction to the Oxford American, including the short story we're discussing today, The Collected Stories of Madison Charles, which appeared in the fall 2011 issue of the magazine. It's right here. Hi, Steve.
Hey, Caroline. Great to see you.
It's great to see you too. Thank you for doing this.
My pleasure.
So, the story we're talking about, The Collected Stories of Madison Charles, is one that we've just digitized for the first time. It's available to read right now at oxfordamerican.org. And I encourage everyone who has not yet read it to pause the video, go read it, and come back to this conversation because we will be spoiling a few things. This story, more than anything of yours that I've read, and your work has concerned itself with literary people, journalists, but this story concerns itself with the moral imperatives and stakes of being a fiction writer in a really direct way.
Hmm.
Your protagonist, Madison Charles, is a fiction writer. I mean, I gather he's a literary realist like you are. He's
Hmm.
leading a novel workshop in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And really early on in the story, we get the sense that his chickens are coming home to roost.
Hmm.
And I guess when we first talked about this story, I think we were going back and forth about maybe digitizing a piece of yours that hadn't yet been digitized. And this story came up, and you called it, I think, metafictional as all hell.
Hmm.
And I'd love to hear more about that and how this story began to take shape and how it made its way to the Oxford American.
Okay. Well, at the beginning of the story, we learn that this narrator, Madison Charles, is teaching a novel workshop at the Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center. And so I believe it was in the summer of 2011, I found myself teaching a workshop at the Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center. And the class met, you know, about 4 or 5 hours a day, starting in early afternoon and ending around 4:30 or so. And after, the first class, somebody said, "Hey, could we go out for beers?" And I said, "Sure, let's do that." And so we started doing it. We'd go out every day for beers. Well, the Celtics were in the NBA playoffs. And I believe it was on Thursday, suddenly they're facing an elimination game. And so when the students said, "Okay, let's go out for beers," it just popped into my head, "Oh no, I can't do that because we're staying out too long and I want to see that game." And I just told them a lie. I could have just said I want to watch the game, but no, I told them a lie. I said, I got this old friend who just called me and sounds like something's going kind of wrong in his life. And he happens to be up here driving around. And he asked me if I'd go out and have dinner with him. And so I'd love to go out with you guys, but I can't do it. And I went and slipped off back to my room and ordered a pizza and watched the ball game. But you know how lies have a way of coming back on you. So the next day, as soon as I walk into class, one of the students said, "How did things go with your friend?" And I started telling him about all the things that were going wrong in his life. His dog died, his wife left him, he's lost his land. And at that point, I thought, you know, there might be a story in this. And when I got home, I started writing the story. So that's where it came from.
Did the Celtics win?
No.
It wasn't even worth it, although we
Well,
did get a
well,
story out of it. Do you mind reading from the first part of the story?
No, happy to. Every now and then, something would make him marvel at the way his life had turned out. Often these moments came in European cities, Paris or Budapest, Dublin or Krakow, and were seldom provoked by any noteworthy event. With his Polish wife, he'd stroll around the corner in Prague's Old Town Square, and there would stand the house of Hermann Kafka, where his son wrote the Metamorphoses. Even though he knew ahead of time that it was going to be there and that it had been seen by a few million people, it made him pause and think of the house where he'd grown up, surrounded by cotton fields that his father worked but didn't own. It seemed fairly amazing that he'd gotten out of Loring County, that he wasn't still down there driving a tractor or checking the oxygen content of a catfish pond. Now, though, he was in the parking lot of the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. He'd moved to Massachusetts the previous year to teach at a prestigious college, and the Work Center had thrown a little money at him to come down to P-Town and conduct a summer class for aspiring novelists. He just taught the next to last session and was waiting for his best friend from high school, Joe David Betts, to pick him up. They hadn't seen each other for 15 years. They hadn't even spoken in all that time. When Joe David phoned him the previous day, he hadn't recognized the number, which was marked private caller, but the area code, 662, alarmed him. Madison's parents both still lived in North Mississippi and were old and sick. Joe David explained that he was giving himself some time to drive around the country, see a few sights he'd never seen before, and generally take stock of his life. He said he was in a transitional period. He'd gotten a cell number from Madison's father, who had also been kind enough to let him know where his son was this week. Joe David said that since he was in Madison's neck of the woods, he thought he'd try to hook up with him. He had visited another old friend the day before in D.C. Madison didn't particularly want to spend time with him, but he could think of no graceful way to refuse. Since Joe David would be driving and it was virtually impossible to park this time of year without a permit, they agreed he'd pick Madison up. He'd be in a black Ford truck, Joe David said, a 2005 F-150 with a dent in the right front quarter panel. It was as though he feared P-Town were full of such vehicles.
That's great. Thank you.
Sure.
I think what's interesting about meeting Madison and meeting Joe David soon after we meet Madison is the contrast that you establish between these two childhood friends. We have Madison, this kind of literary New Englander, and then Joe David, who is called JD throughout the piece, who's this kind of down and out redneck, quote unquote. He's definitely a fish out of water in Provincetown. And as we move it, like shortly after the part that you read, we see that Madison's embarrassed. He doesn't want it to be seen with this guy, even though they were great friends growing up.
Mm-hmm.
So the contrast that you established, though, is from Madison's perspective because the story is told from his point of view. And I'd love to know how you want readers to respond to Joe David's arrival and Madison's assessment of him. Do we trust it?
Um, I think that initially maybe a reader trusts it, but I also think that probably the more they find out about Madison and the uses to which he has sometimes put people near and dear to him in the writing of works of fiction, he becomes less and less trustworthy. That's my guess. Um, I think, as to whether or not I intended that when I began writing, I'm not really sure because when I start writing a story, and of course, I haven't written stories in years, only novels. When I start, I have only a general idea of where I'm going. And I remember once at the Sewanee Writers Conference telling that to a workshop, and a couple of the fellows in the class who were accomplished writers themselves. They were just appalled. How can you do that? That just is a recipe for trouble. And my answer always is, if I planned everything out, I think I'd lose interest in writing, because for me it's an act of discovery. And I recall writing this story and having my own attitudes about both of these characters change as things develop between them. Only a couple of which were foreseen. I just figured they'd have dinner together. I had no idea where it was going to go after that, and
Well,
I'm okay with that.
yeah, I mean, you're as a reader, your attitude about these characters does change throughout the story. And I mean, initially, when I first read it, I was skeptical of Madison's perspective because I kept going to that kind of, I don't even know where it comes from, but that kind of famous line about fiction, there only being two stories, a stranger comes to town and a guy goes on a journey or whatever.
Yeah,
And if anyone's a stranger in town, it's Joe David.
of
And
course.
so I'm poised to find him interesting, perhaps even more interesting than Madison, because he's pretending that he's not at all interesting.
Hmm.
Um, so they get in Joe David's truck, to the embarrassment of Madison, and Madison has him drive them out to this kind of out of the way restaurant, this kind of local hangout that caters to more working class people.
Hmm.
And on that drive, we get some backstory. Madison recalls Joe David's life and its various many pitfalls. We learn that his wife had an affair and has left him. He's lost his house and his farm. He's working at the Dollar General Distribution Center. And then Madison kind of reveals that he's leveraged all of this, or the worst parts of Joe David's life, in his novels. And
Hmm.
not just Joe David, but the entirety of his landscape and community from his upbringing. All of that's been material for him. And we get this wonderful scene, and stop me if I'm summarizing too much, but I feel like all of this is important for people to know, where Madison is back in his hometown and he runs into an old neighbor at Walmart, and the guy literally rams his shopping cart into Madison's cart and says that line, "Can't you just figure out a way to make shit up?"
Yeah.
And we realize that Madison probably has a sense of why Joe David might have shown up there.
Hmm.
It feels like he's preparing his defenses, and we get that defense. That I'll just read from the story. There are two great sentences. Every profession has its hazards, and he often told himself that either you believed in what you were doing or you didn't. If you considered the world better because there were stories and novels to read, and you happened to be one of the folks who were responsible for writing them, you couldn't worry too much about where the inspiration came from. And so at this point of the story, we're just entering a lot more complex territory, and this is kind of where that perspective of these characters might start to shift. So I'd love to know what your impression is of these two men at this point.
Well, I literally do see Madison as somebody who's betrayed a friend. Now, he's probably one of the ways that he's probably justified that. It's not just the feelings that he expresses about you can't worry too much about it if you're writing fiction. I think on some level he does worry about it and has worried about it. It's just that coming from a community in which most of the people there have never read a book. If they've read any fiction at all, they haven't read Madison's books. You just feel like as a writer of literary fiction, it's easy to start feeling like, I've got a degree of protection there because people are not going to do it. They're not going to read it. They're not going to come across it. And it is surprising sometimes how they do come across it. As I once had somebody from my hometown tell me, I hadn't ever read a book except the ones written by you. And when you got somebody who can say that to you. I never read a book. I think this person meant novel, but maybe they really meant the book. Except those written by you. You know they're not reading the work the way everybody else is reading it. They are reading it looking for something, right? And they may be the only person on earth who sees it. So I guess my feelings about Madison are complicated by that awareness. And Caroline, I'm sure you've heard me say this because we've known each other a long time, but about every other book I ever published, my father would quit speaking to me. He'd get mad. And, he'd usually get over it in about a week or 10 days. And the next thing I would know, he had bought a whole crate of books and wanted me to sign them. And he would go around town handing them out. But his initial reaction was typically anger. And I think fear. I think he was really feared that somebody was going to come up to him on the street, as somebody once did, and say some bad things about his son. And then that was going to put him in the position, probably because he had a bad temper, of getting furious and wanting to throttle whoever it was. Um, so I on the one hand, I don't absolve Madison for doing what he does. On the other hand, if writers of fiction quit doing it, we wouldn't have a lot of fiction out there in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think this might be a good time to. I introduced you and I talked about, the books that you've written and the awards you've won, but I didn't say that you have been an educator for your professor of creative writing for a long time. I don't know how many years exactly, 30 years?
41.
Whoa, okay, yeah. I mean, so this question must come up all the time in your classes. Like what is the ethical line? And what do you usually say to people?
Well, I tell them that when I first started writing fiction, I sometimes didn't use the degree of invention that I began to much later on. In other words, it was almost like, you know, I would shut my imagination down. If something happened on a single day in a single place and it involved somebody with red hair, that's the way it was probably going to go. And later on, I began to move things around, let my invention, my degree of inventiveness take over, and usually made the character a lot more interesting to myself than when I really did have a particular episode or a particular individual in mind. I think that's one of the things you have to learn as a young writer if you care about learning it. And many writers don't care about learning it. I think you've heard me say how much I admired the work of James Salter. And there was a profile of Salter that came out in the New Yorker, I want to say about 12 or 13 years ago, in conjunction with the publication of his final novel. And it recounted a story that had been told by a woman who lived near Salter in the Hudson Valley. And she happened to be in the city one day, and she ran into Salter on the street and asked him how he was doing. And he said, "I'm fine. I just got a copy of my latest novel, and I'd like to give it to you." And so she handed it to her. And this woman is visiting the city with her daughter, and she's so eager to read the novel that she says, "Would you mind driving us back?" And so while her daughter's driving, she starts reading the novel, and she's no more than 3 or 4 pages in before she realizes that one of the two main characters is most definitely her.
Mm,
It's that obvious. And he did that a lot.
wow.
One of my former colleagues who had known Salter in France and in an alpine community where Salter set his novel Solo Faces, because Salter was a mountain climber. Whenever I mentioned Salter to him, he would just get really angry. He said, I just consider him, he's a great writer, but he's not a good man.
Like possibly Madison Charles.
Not possibly so. Yeah.
So back to the story. They arrive at this restaurant. They sit at the bar. They drink a lot,
A lot.
a lot. Um, the conversation between them is so interesting because it follows this kind of familiar trajectory of kind of reconnecting with somebody
Mhm.
who you used to know, basically, like you used to be friends, but you haven't connected in a really long time. So there are these very stilted moments. They sit in silence and then they veer towards really intimate. But two really important things from my perspective happen in this conversation while they're drinking and then eating at this restaurant that I'd love to hear you talk about. One is there's this mounting tension. We kind of feel it at the beginning of the story,
Mhm.
and you get this sense that JD's resentment is just becoming more and more apparent. He's never explicit about why, but it's just this kind of mounting tension in this scene. The other thing that happens that was really interesting to me is this kind of curveball reveal that the characters' stations in life have totally reversed.
Yeah.
So JD, Joe David, was born into this family of wealth and privilege, land, country club memberships. His dad gave him flying lessons. Um, Madison was born into none of that. And so without any advantages. And
Mhm.
so I'd love to hear you talk about the class dynamics that are at play inside the friendship
Mhm.
here.
Yeah, well, the Delta is a very class-oriented place. Most people think of the Mississippi Delta, I think, not unreasonably, depending on how much they know about it and what their own relationship to it might be. They think of it as a place where, it is predominantly black, you know, pretty much everywhere you go in the Delta. For instance, my hometown is 85% black. And it was probably around 70% when I lived there. But the situation is that virtually all of the land is owned by white farmers, and it's been in their family for 100 or even more than 100 years in some instances. And, land is what has value. And I think there's an attitude there on the part of some people who I won't name. Um, I'm somebody special because my family has this land. And I don't deny that somebody who came in and settled the Delta at the end of the 19th century when it was all, forest and mosquitoes and cottonmouth moccasins, those were the natural inhabitants of the place. I don't deny that it took a very determined, hardy kind of person to do that. On the other hand, um, there are a lot of other people there, the Native Americans who were removed and robbed of the land, the large number of enslaved people in a county like, say, the figure that sticks in my hand is prior to the Civil War in Washington County, Mississippi, there were 14 enslaved people for every free person.
Mm.
And so I think, you know, where the class stuff comes in this particular story is Joe David is from one of those families. And Joe David, from Madison's perspective, has been given everything you could ask for in a monetary sense, all the privilege you could ever hope for. And what has he done? He's lost it all. He didn't want to, he didn't want to switch to catfish. He wanted to do row crop farming because he found it aesthetically pleasing and because it was what his father and his grandfather and his great grandfather had done. And here's Madison, born into a poor white family with nothing but his own sense of desire for something better and a certain degree of intelligence and some ability to do something that not many people can do very well. And I think they're both smoldering with resentment. I think on some level, JD looks at Madison and thinks, why is he doing so well when I'm doing so bad? It's not supposed to be like that. And conversely, Madison is thinking, I believe he's got a problem with what I've written because he's seen himself in it. And how dare he get in my way? I didn't get anything at birth. I only have myself. So I think that's the dynamic that's going on there, and they are both getting quite angry at one another and at fate.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because this story was written in 2011, and you do establish Joe David as a Republican. I mean, he
Mhm.
arrives with the Bush Cheney McCain Palin stickers on his dented Ford truck. Um, you also create a more complex read of him. But when I got to that scene or that part of the scene when they're in the restaurant and that kind of class reversal is on display, I understood it so well and I thought it was so interesting because it does feel like Joe David is operating from a place of I deserve this just because of my heritage, which is a very scary and prevalent thing back then for a very long time and now too.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know if you wanted to talk about the politics then versus the politics now and how you might write the story differently, but it did come to mind. At the same time, I was reading Madison and thinking, oh, well, this is his justification for writing about Joe David. He
Yeah,
feels like this is fair game because he's been living in that resentment.
yeah. Well, if I were to address how I would write it now, I wouldn't be able to write it now. I don't, I mean, we're friends. So I'm just going to go ahead and say this, and it won't surprise you. These days, that kind of attitude has landed us in a really bad, terrible place, and I don't have any sympathy with it.
Mm-mm.
I've lost the ability to sympathize people who are still defending something that I find appalling and terrifying beyond measure. And that includes a lot of people I grew up with. And it's to the point where I feel like I don't know them anymore. Did I ever really know them at all?
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting thing to consider. This story works so well in its time period, but I also think it resonates now just as well, um, even if you wouldn't sit down and write it today.
Yeah, well, good.
I mean, that scene ends with, I guess, like to hit the nail on the head, the scene ends with that wonderful line of from Joe David saying, you harbor false notions. And Madison's like, what are you talking about? And he says, about who I am and who you are, as if, this is preordained. I am this and you are that. And these are two white men. So like we're we're talking about within like that narrow of a context, he has this sense of privilege that he's
Mhm.
operating from. They leave. They get back in Joe David's pickup and start drunk driving around the Cape, not in any direction that Madison thinks is the right one.
Yeah,
And Joe David puts on Tchaikovsky, which I thought was an interesting choice.
yeah,
Um, Maybe deliberately. I mean, to kind of throw another curveball at Madison.
yeah.
Um, but he also kind of begins this more direct and aggressive line of questioning. And
Hmm.
finally, he says outright what this entire reunion has been leading towards, which is that he's read Madison's books. He hadn't before, didn't have time for them, and now since his wife left, he had some time on his hands, and he knows that he's been an inspiration. And we get kind of like he doesn't say it again, but that line from earlier in the piece that's so wonderful, can't you just figure out a way to make shit up, comes back into mind because JD starts criticizing Madison's lack of creativity and kind of enumerating all the real world things he sees from his life and the lives of other people in his community. Um, and amid all of that, we get this very meta paragraph describing how Madison would write the scene if he was living it out in that moment. And I thought that was a really interesting choice,
Mhm.
a very Madison choice, a very appropriate choice, that he would be in this very chaotic, terrifying, harrowing, like tense situation and be thinking about how he'd put it on the page.
Yeah. Have you ever been in a situation like that yourself? See, I'm the interviewer now.
Oh, you know what? I don't think so. I tend to respond to things in the moment a little bit. I mean, maybe that's a good thing, but I maybe only in hindsight, I think. I can't think of a time that I would have been in a situation like that, or even a situation that's less stressful than that and thought about how am I going to write this? Have you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, and I'll tell you this, some years ago, I judged one of the three judges for the Penn Faulkner Award for fiction. And one of the finalists that year was, well, one of my two or three favorite writers in the world, and that was Don DeLillo. And so I found myself, I believe this was the night before the event, the award ceremony, or maybe it was even the night after the event. I can't remember. But I was at a table with DeLillo, and there was one of the other judges at the table, and my wife Eva was there, and DeLillo's wife was there, and then a writer who was, on the Penn Faulkner Foundation. I think maybe she had her husband too. And DeLillo was directly across the table from me. I hadn't really talked to him. I talked to his wife a lot. And he was just completely silent. And I don't know what I expected from Don DeLillo. I expect him to be laughing a lot or saying funny things. And at a certain point, I looked at him and I thought, oh my God, he's just sitting there. He's just like a video recorder, you know, he's just taking it all in. Um, and at the same time, I found myself thinking, yeah, well, what have you been doing all your life? You know?
I mean, it's a pretty good skill for a fiction writer to have. I think I'll change my answer. When I've been a journalist, when I've been in the role of a journalist reporting a story, absolutely. I'm like, oh, this scene, this, what they've just said here, what, the way that person walked into a room. I don't think that I have your fiction brain at all. I clearly do not have your fiction brain, but I admire that skill.
Well, it cuts down on invitations sometimes.
People don't want to be, what is it? There's a line in this story with, and we haven't talked about her, but there's a character, Lola, who is a old friend and paramour of Madison's. And I
Mhm.
think at one point she tells him that his writing makes her feel like a specimen in a biology lab.
Yeah,
As people might be afraid of that if they spend too many hours around a fiction writer.
yeah. It has. I have had a couple of times somebody look at me and say, "You better not put this in a book." So,
What's your response when someone says that?
oh God, I never do that. I mean, why would you think I would put this in a book? I write fiction.
That's a good line. I think Madison has some practiced lines. Not
Hmm.
saying you have a practice line, but we're leading into the climax of the story. And I'd love to hear you describe what happens in the car. But right before we get to that point, Madison starts kind of his defense. Um, and I'll read what he's thinking to himself or saying out loud. He heard himself say something about how the real became both more and less than itself, how the truth of the tale was all that mattered, how when you were writing, you lost sight of life as it was, focusing instead on life as it might have been. You were trying to dig down into the subsoil. I
Mhm.
don't get the sense that he entirely believes what he's saying in this moment. Do you want to talk about the scene and what happens?
Well, he starts getting, just at the level of plot, as you know, he starts getting scared because one of the things he's always known about Joe David, they were both football players together, and they were pretty good football players. And so he's always known that Joe David, unlike him, Madison kept his head about him on the football field. Joe David would just lose it. I mean, he would turn purple, and um, he couldn't control his emotions as well as Madison did. And so he starts getting fearful because he knows he's really mad. And he knows that he's really lost pretty much everything that he ever had. And now he feels betrayed by somebody that he considered a friend who he never did anything bad to. And so he's feeling a lot of anxiety, Madison is. And he's even thinking, we come from gun culture, and he's not taking me back to my hotel like he's supposed to be taking me back. And oh my God, where is this headed? So that's what's going on. Does Madison believe what he says to himself? Here's what I think he believes. I do think he believes that there's a certain point at which you've borrowed from life and you honestly cannot remember what you've invented and what you haven't.
Mhm.
And, you know, a story that I've told a lot is about, um, when I met my future wife, I had a handgun. I'm from gun culture. I grew up with guns. Um, and it was a 22 target pistol that my father had given me. I never did anything with it. It was loaded, however. And Eva told me, I'm not going to move in with you until you get rid of that gun. I will not have a gun in the house. And so I got rid of it. She didn't think I knew what to do with it. I didn't seem like somebody who could handle a gun. And one particular day, this is in Virginia, near Blacksburg, because I was teaching at Virginia Tech, there was another man from Poland who lived there. He was a doctor. He was actually our doctor, and he had moved to the U.S., I think, in the 60s or something like that. He invited us to a party at his home out in the country, and there was another older man there. So these, I was in my 30s. These men were in their 60s probably. When we get to the party, they've got a target pistol, and they're out in the backyard, and they've got a Coke can suspended from a tree branch, and they're trying to hit the Coke can, and neither one of them ever hits it. They shoot at it several times, and they're terrible. And then the doctor looks at me and he says, "Steve, would you like to try? You're from the South. You." And Eva said, "Don't give him that. He has no idea what to do with it." I took it and I hit that can 13 times in a row. um, I mean, we had to reload the gun, and finally I missed. And so my friend Skip Hayes, who you've heard me mention, who's got, by the way, a fabulous novel coming out, posthumously published, called The Great Awakening. Skip and I tell that story to one another a lot. And the last time we told it, Eva became aware that it was being told in a different way. Skip was telling it for some dinner guests, and the thing was that he put himself in the story. He was there and he saw it. And Eva said, finally, comes right into the middle of this and says, "Skip, you weren't there." And it was like, you could see the two of us looking at each other, and he says, Eva, it's more effective as a story if I saw it, you know, and that's what we do.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. That's the way memory works. It's also, he's right. It's a literary device. It's more effective as a story if he was there.
Yeah, you know what? I only hit it 4 times,
Not 13,
not 13.
I was
I
going to
think
say.
I started by saying I hit it 6 times, and then it became 8, and then it became 10, and then it became 13. Before I die, I'm liable to be up to 30 or 40.
Yeah, and no one is going to correct you. It's just, that's the way stories work.
Yeah. She once asked me, why do you and Skip keep telling the same story again and again? You know how it ends. Well, we're trying to see if there's a better way to tell it.
Well, you didn't take us to the climax.
Well, the climax, I guess, depending on how you define the climax, I mean, I would define the climax as what is essentially the anticlimax, where they're together after this, thing has happened between the two of them, and they're just kind of hugging one another and, being old Southern guys after drinking too much and kissing and making up, basically. But finally, Joe David parks the truck, and he reaches under the seat, and it's dark. He pulls out what Madison thinks is the largest handgun he's ever seen in his life. And as he braces himself for the impact of a bullet in the chest, he hears a whirring sound and he realizes that Joe Bob has pulled out a Black& Decker drill and that's what he's being threatened with. So,
Okay. And that's how I was defining the climax, although I do see your point, because they do move on from this event. But it was at this moment in the story, and I might go off the rails here and tell me if you think my read is wrong, but this is where I felt like Joe David has orchestrated his own narrative here. This is somebody who probably has a gun in the truck somewhere that's
probably,
within
almost
easy
certainly.
reach. It feels deliberate in a way that's just like one more thing I'm going to do to subvert Madison's expectations.
Yeah. And you asked me, I think, or maybe you said this in print, something along the lines of, I wonder if you saw that. In other words, I wonder if you, me, the writer, if you saw that, or if that's something that the reader sees that you don't. And the answer is both. I mean, when I was writing it, I did not plan to have a power drill in the car, in the truck. I was not sure how it would end. Um, and I wasn't even thinking very much. That's just what came to me in the moment. And I felt like that was what was called for. Do I think Joe David orchestrated all of this? Uh, Possibly, possibly not. Yes, he probably would have a gun in the truck, but he also probably would have a drill in the truck.
Might have reached for the wrong thing.
He might have reached for the wrong thing. He may or may not have known much more about what he was going to do than Madison knew about what he was going to do. But that's one of those moments where, um, as I used to say in fiction workshop, and by the way, I will tell everybody watching this that in those 41 years, the best short story I was ever given was one of yours.
Ugh.
It just absolutely took my breath away, and that you published a few years ago in the Georgia Review. Um, I'm okay with the reader seeing something that I don't. In fact, I think it's problematic if the reader never sees anything other than exactly what I saw. I like fruitful ambiguity. And if you remember the night we talked about that story of yours in the classroom, there was one other student who has gone on to publish quite a bit of fiction herself, including a well-received novel. She knew what was going on in the story, and I knew what was going on in the story, but you got a lot of blank looks that night because you didn't state it. It was implied, and the reader had to really focus on the details to have a solid notion of what would happen. And a lot of them missed it. And there were some smart readers in there. So to me, fruitful ambiguity, that's what I'm happiest with in fiction.
I mean, I'm drawn to that as well. And thank you. That is too kind of you to say about my work. I appreciate that. I think
Oh,
what I was reading also when I was in graduate school, a collection of Percival Everett's short stories. And I remember reading an interview with him saying something similar. Like, after I'm finished with a story, it's really not my business,
yeah.
how people read it. And I'd rather have, multiple readings rather than a prescribed way for people to read a story that I've written. It also seems like it saves you to have that attitude. It saves you a lot of heartache.
Yeah.
If you're expecting everyone to take your work a particular way, it's just never going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I don't want them to. When my first novel came out, I got an email from somebody I didn't know who he was, but turned out he was quite a good journalist, and was a native Mississippian who's writing for a large East Coast paper. And he asked me what happened at the end of the novel, The Oxygen Man, my first novel, which is, I mean, it's ambiguity on steroids at the end of that novel. And, so I wrote back and I said, well, I guess my thinking is this is probably what's going on just at the level of plot and what happens next to this character. And he wrote me about a 6-page email telling me what that was not what was happening. And he had all worked it out. And I remember thinking, well, then, dude, go write the novel, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's something kind of beautiful in that, actually.
I
Like,
did too. I,
yeah.
somebody who has thought so deeply about it over and over, what more could you ask for?
Hmm.
And I'm thrilled when somebody will tell me they saw something that I didn't necessarily know was there. But, you know, I've probably read The Lady with the Pet Dog over the course of my life. I bet I've read that story 300 times. And the last time I reread it was probably 3 or 4 years ago because I'm not teaching anymore. I used to use that story a lot. And even then, I saw something I'd never noticed in the story before. Uh, That's a great story.
It's a great story. Um, we're pretty much at the end of your story, and I will talk about that moment where they kind of kiss and make up. They after he returns the power drill to, to its place, he pulls out a bottle of wild turkey and they split that. They pass that back and forth, and they talk a little bit more about these kinds of like moral imperatives and the truth of storytelling and whether or not Madison actually believes this. And Jay, he says he has some doubts and he talks about why he has those doubts. And JD says, "Well, are you going to turn this into a story? This event that we've just had, are you going to turn it into a story?"
Mhm.
And we get, if you have the story, I would love to hear you read the last two paragraphs if you have it in front of you with an
Yeah.
easy reach, because it's just really interesting to get in Madison's head at that point.
Okay. Joe David handed him the wild turkey, then said, you ain't going to turn tonight into a story, are you? The last few hours, Madison suddenly saw. offered undeniable potential. An old friend shows up from nowhere after traveling countless miles, fueled by a sense of betrayal. He's hurt for himself and those he holds dear. He's out of his element in a strange place with no backup. He couldn't stick out worse if he threw off all his clothes and tied a balloon to his big toe. He's at a grave advantage from the moment he appears on the page. The betrayer, on the other hand, a man whom the old friend has always trusted, is morally hobbled by belief in his own destiny, the certainty that he serves the highest power. At heart, a collector, he's given himself carte blanche. Any story he finds is his to tell. He won't let anything get in his way.
What do you think Madison's going to do next?
Right story.
So, when I finished reading the story, and this could be another thing that's not intentional, but I was like, did I just read a fictionalized tale? Have I been in a Madison Charles story? Is this what I've, I mean, that's kind of where I went because I was like, well, clearly he's going to write the story. And is this it? Is that something that was ever in your head, or am I just like reading something that you weren't intending?
Um, well, I'm a traditional realist. I'm not somebody who traffics in metafiction. But in this one story, I did.
Hmm.
And yes, I intend for the reader to be asking a question about what's real. Did this happen? Um, is this real?
Hmm.
And I and I'm fine with the fact that some people are probably going to answer it one way, and some people are going to answer another, and some people may read it and change their minds over time. Um, I know that a lot of people hearing me read it, they assume that it happened. But I think some of the smarter people don't necessarily think that. Maybe that's the first thing they think. And then later on, um, perhaps they change their minds about it. And I'm good with that.
We talked about this a little bit before we started recording this call, and you cut a little bit from the ending of the story and the version that we've published to the website. And if I can find it, I can. Do you remember those last lines or the tenor of those last lines?
I remember the tenor of the last lines. I can't quote them exactly.
Oh, I
I
can't.
did.
I've got them.
Okay.
Okay. He won't let anything get in his way, is where the story ended. In the end, of course, he's the one who must suffer the realization that he's granted himself too much license. That's what this story calls for. That's the way such stories work.
Yeah.
Can you talk about why you cut those?
Well, so when we were doing the page proofs, one of the editors at the Oxford American, and it wasn't the editor in chief, and I don't even know exactly who it was. It may have been the associate editor, or it may have been one of the interns. I don't think they actually told me who had said this, but somebody there had said, I think this story maybe should have ended a little bit earlier. And they identified a specific spot, and I can't remember where the spot was. I looked at it, and that didn't work for me. But it always bothered me. Once I saw the story in print, I thought this story did indeed go on a few lines too long. I just don't know where I should have ended it, but I didn't like that when I saw it. I thought it was clear to me I'd made a mistake. And so sometime, I don't know, about a year ago, I guess, I was going to Fresno to do a reading. And, I'm at the time, was probably 150 pages into the novel that I'm still working on. And my novels don't break down into freestanding sections, they're sort of interlocking parts. I didn't want to read from the novel. And I thought, well, gosh, I don't write stories anymore. Uh, and at that point, I thought, well, this story always went over really well with readings. I read it right after writing it at the Swanee Writers Conference, and I was just mobbed when I got through reading it. Mark Strand came up and put his arms around me and wanted to talk about it. And every time I saw Mark for the rest of his life, he would go back to talking about the story. Robert Haas, same thing. Um, and so I thought, well, maybe this would be a good one to read. And then I got to that ending, and it still bothered me. It bothered me more than ever. But I thought at that point I knew where it should have ended, and so that's why I tweaked it.
I'm not surprised by the reception you got to this story, particularly among writers, because it does feel like a story for writers, even though, all literary folks, anyone who picks up a short story is going to like the story. I feel like a writer is going to connect with it in a really intimate way and have a lot of feelings about it.
Yeah, well, it was it went over particularly well with the poets.
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't know what to make of that
I don't either.
specific, um, except that poets tend to be really interested. Not that fiction writers aren't, but I think poets are hyper aware of form.
Hmm.
Um, and so maybe that was part of it. I don't know. But I've always, I mean, I've written stories that I liked when I wrote them, and I don't particularly want to look at them again, um, because I'm like 40 something years older than I was when I wrote some of them. But this one I've always liked. Uh,
Hmm.
I like reading it, and I'm pleased that, you thought it was worthy of discussing.
I can't thank you enough for talking with me about this. I have loved having this conversation. I love talking with you about writing anyway, but it's just nice to be able to break down a story with the author. I mean, that's a rare treat.
Well, I love talking to you about writing. We've had some of the best conversations that I've ever had in my life have been with you. So I'm honored to be here. And, the Oxford American is really important in my literary history. I haven't published in there in a long time because I'm not writing stories. But I think it's a spectacular publication. I'm always proud to have my name associated with it. And you're doing great things there.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Steve.
My pleasure.